Hi everyone, welcome to episode 17 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. We're a podcast produced by the US program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. I'm Kevin, an Associate Research Fellow with USP.
Hi, this is Adrian, Research Fellow and Coordinator of the US program.
And we'll be your host for this episode on US strategy in a fragmented, multipolar world, a conversation with Zack Cooper. The US has been a strategic actor in Indo-Pacific for decades, but it is facing an increasingly fragmented and multipolar world. Even as Washington engages its partners and allies in the region, fixed alliances in the vein of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, are too rigid and disruptive for regional actors to accept. Rather, smaller, more nimble coalitions on specific issues have been gaining popularity. Joining us to discuss this issue is Dr. Zack Cooper, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Visiting Senior Fellow at RSIS. Zack teaches at Princeton University and serves as Chair of the Board of the Open Technology Fund. Thank you for speaking with us, Zack.
Of course, great to be here. Thanks, Kevin.
So, Zack, how would you evaluate the current state of US strategy in the Indo-Pacific? What are the main achievements of the Biden administration strategy?
Well, I think the Biden team has done really well in some specific areas, especially with traditional American allies. And here I mean treaty allies. And not all five of them. We have Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and Thailand as treaty allies. But it's pretty clear that we're struggling with Thailand for a variety of reasons at the moment. But the other four, I think you've seen real advances with each of them. The United States and Japan have made pretty consequential changes to the command and control structures in Japan. That's just happened in the last couple of months. The United States and South Korea have been trying to tighten their alliance and have been working much more globally than they have before, trying to focus not just on things on the Korean Peninsula, but elsewhere as well. The U.S. and the Philippines have been doing a lot recently, including additional U.S. access in the Philippines and coordination on this Luzon corridor development that's really important to Manila. And then finally, the U.S. and Australia have been working together on not just AUKUS, but a range of defense technology efforts as well. So I think if you look at those traditional alliances, there's been real progress. And you could probably throw some other partnerships in there. U.S.-India relations, U.S.-Vietnam relations have hit new highs in the last few years. So I think if you look at all of those ties, the Biden team rates quite well in the region. Where they've struggled, unfortunately, is here in Southeast Asia. And as you all know well, the reasons, in my view, are more structural than they are having to do with the Biden team's actual individual approach to this. They're the same challenges that the Trump team faced, and in some ways that the Obama team faced as well. And so I think if you look at U.S. strategy, what you're seeing is kind of a hole in the middle, and that hole, unfortunately, is Southeast Asia. That would be my assessment. So overall, probably A for what the U.S. has done with its traditional treaty allies and a handful of others, and maybe a B+ or a C for how it's been engaging in Southeast Asia.
I see. Thank you.
Zack, if I could follow up on your point about Southeast Asia. The ASEAN summits are happening in Vientiane, Laos right now. And some critics have pointed out that President Biden is not attending those summits, but Hurricane Milton barreling down on Florida, that's quite understandable. But you pointed out structural problems in the relationship, and some have argued that the US and ASEAN should have a more realistic understanding of the relationship, that we should not expect the president to attend all ASEAN summits, that, we should recalibrate the relationship to perhaps at the vice presidential level. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, my personal view is that if we are saying that the Indo-Pacific is the priority region for the United States and the world, and the most important summit each year in the Indo-Pacific region is the East Asia Summit. At least that's what the United States has tried to make happen, right? We've been big supporters of the East Asia Summit for strategic reasons. So, look, the reality is when American presidents then don't show up to the most important summit of the year, I think it sends a signal. And Xi Jinping sometimes gets away with sending the Chinese premier to some of these summits and maybe doesn't face as much questioning. But look, the US is a little bit further away. And so I think it's more important that the US show that it's engaged and relevant in the region. And I appreciate how much of a strain this is on American presidents and their schedulers to find time, especially when those summits take place in the fall and the US has elections every 2 or certainly every 4 years that the president's going to want to be engaged on. So I understand we're not going to get the president there every single year. But my view is that if the president can't make it to the East Asia Summit, that sends a signal. And it also sends a signal when the American president does other meetings related to Asia and doesn't come to EAS, right? So when the American president engages at the leader level with the Quad, with the AUKUS leaders, with Japan and Korea in that trilateral, that sends a pretty clear signal about where American priorities are. And I think part of the takeaway is that ASEAN and ASEAN-centered organizations are maybe less important than they were to the United States. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but I think that's the signal that U.S. lack of attendance sends. And so I appreciate all the challenges that the U.S. is going to have trying to carve out time for a president to come all the way out to Asia every year and come to the East Asia Summit and maybe also to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit and other meetings that are inevitably going to happen in the region, whether it's the G20 or G7 or others. But I think if the Indo-Pacific is the priority theater and the East Asia Summit is the main summit for all the players in the region, then the US president is just going to have to show up, or it sends a signal about our priorities maybe not being what we say they are.
Thanks, Zach. If I could then follow up on that in terms of American signals to the region about how important the region is to US grand strategy, because one of the signals or lack of signals is in economics and trade. So the Trump administration pulled out of TPP, and what we have been left with the Biden administration is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. And now the Trump administration has also signaled that it will even pull out of IPEF. So what can the region really expect from the US in terms of trade and economics moving forward?
Boy, this is another tough question, Adrian. I think the region can expect continued engagement at all levels from American businesses on trade and investment. And as friends in Singapore know well, the U.S. is a huge investor in the region, and that's not going to change. But if we're talking about market access, I don't see a clear path forward for the U.S. on market access. And that is going to put a ceiling, I think, on some of our engagement across the region, especially on the trade side, which is so critical. And unfortunately, it's a bipartisan problem now in Washington, right? Both parties are sort of arguing that they are the party of the working class. Both are arguing that trade disadvantaged American workers. This was the argument that Trump put forward in 2016 and that he instituted when he pulled out of TPP in 2017. But if you listen to the Biden and the Harris teams, they also make the argument that many of the trade deals, especially with China, but not just with China, that the U.S. has entered into hurt American workers. And I think if you actually look at the data, there certainly are areas in which American workers were harmed. Although if we go back to putting high tariffs on, potentially a global level, but certainly even on just some key players, I think we're going to see the value of freer trade. But that's still not a politically popular argument. So I fear that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, everyone knows it's insufficient, and yet no one can come up with anything better. I think the difference between Trump and Harris might be that the Trump team is more interested in doing bilateral trade deals maybe with the Philippines, maybe one or two others. The Harris team, I think they would probably follow Biden's lead and try and continue the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So look to something more multilateral. But again, without market access, I think it's just going to be viewed with some suspicion by a lot of our friends in the region.
I see. Thank you. So, Zach, speaking of these deals between the US and countries in this region, though, I was just wondering, Washington's created quite a few deals with countries here, or is thinking of doing deals with countries here, including the critical mineral partnerships with countries like Indonesia. Vietnam's VinFast, for example, has launched a manufacturing plant in North Carolina to try and take advantage of IRA tax credits. And then you also have, like you mentioned just now, the Luzon Economic Corridor between the US and the Philippines. Do you think there's any value to trying to park all these very disparate initiatives under, say, one bigger framework like IPEF, or would this just muddy the waters and make things a little bit more contentious?
I think one of the challenges the United States has is that everyone feels that the U.S. has a lot of investment in the region, but because it's American companies doing the investment rather than American government, we often don't get as much credit as, say, China gets with Belt and Road investments.
Yeah.
And so there is a desire to almost do what the Chinese do, which, as you all know, it's not that BRI is necessarily involved in everything. Many things are just labeled BRI projects that were pre-existing before BRI started, or frankly don't have much to do at all with BRI, but there's an incentive for Chinese companies and enterprises to label them as BRI projects. I think that could be a desire on the U.S. part also to try and get a little bit more credit for the kinds of engagement that the U.S. does in the region. But the constraint will be that American businesses don't really care whether the United States is getting credit for projects. What they care about is whether the projects are yielding the value that they were hoping for, right? Or are they getting the revenues out of these projects that they expected? And so I think it's going to be difficult for the United States to label many of these projects in the way that the Chinese government has been able to do with BRI. And in some ways, I think, therefore, trying to compete symmetrically with the Chinese is probably a losing battle for the United States, right? China, it's going to be able to do lots of things on the infrastructure side that the U.S. can't or won't do. It's going to be more effective at labeling some of those projects and, in some cases, using them for political leverage, because American businesses don't really care whether the U.S. government wants them to do something or not. That's not the metric that they're using when they make decisions. So I doubt that the United States is going to be effective at trying to label in that way. And I think the best way for the U.S. to compete is just to double down on what we're good at, which means we're good at finding projects that actually yield value for all of the partners involved, right? And we're frankly better than the Chinese are at respecting environmental standards and ensuring that there's transparency around the projects that are being proposed, working with local labor and local businesses on those projects. Those are all strengths that the U.S. has. I think if we get into a labeling battle with Beijing, we're going to lose that battle pretty badly.
Speaking of, leveraging America's strengths, the Biden administration has played up the Quad as a vehicle for American influence in the region, but also, careful to label the Quad as not being directed at China per se. So speaking of labeling, or how do you see the Quad involvement in the region moving forward? Because one of the problems we see in the region is a lot of initiatives are supposed to be placed under the Quad, but no one is actually sure whether a lot of the projects that are put forward by, say, Japan, Australia, or India are bilateral initiatives or Quad initiatives.
And beyond that, there's also quite a bit of uncertainty over the nature of the Quad. Is it this kind of security grouping that sometimes does developmental stuff? Or is it a developmental grouping that, has security connotations buried deep within? There's still an open question here, I think.
I think it's an open question in Washington. As you all know, the Quad used to be called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Yep. And many people get this wrong now, but the Quad is no longer called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It's actually formally just the Quad now. And the reason was that several of the countries wanted to de-emphasize the security nature of the Quad. I personally think this is trying to be a bit too cute. when you did the intro, Kevin, you were talking about, the fragmented system we're in and relying on more flexible coalitions. And I think when you think about those coalitions, what's most important is what is the purpose of this grouping? What is it trying to do? And if you step back and you ask that about the Quad, I think the answer is, well, the best thing that the Quad has in common is it has India, Japan, Australia, the United States, which all have some security concerns about Chinese behavior. That's the one thing they have in common, right? They don't have much else in common. The US and India are having some challenges with their democracies at home. Of course, all four democracies, but in different ways. India and the US are increasingly protectionist, so there's not a lot of shared economic vision for the region. The technological capabilities across those four are hugely different. Their views on major global governance issues like climate and health are also very different in some cases. So what is it that they really have in common? It's a security desire to make sure that China doesn't dominate the Indo-Pacific region. And I think the actions the Quad has been taking are done with that in mind. So whether we label something a Quad activity or not, I think the logic behind it and the reason that the United States is so excited about the Quad is because it's a grouping that can try and demonstrate value to the region. It doesn't have to be value in the security space, but I think ultimately what Washington is trying to do is show that these democracies outside of Southeast Asia can provide value to Southeast Asia and to the Pacific, tangible value that China can't or won't. So my personal view is that it sounds a lot to me like a grouping that has security in mind, even if we've taken the security portion of the label out of the Quad's name.
So, Zach, what you mentioned about the complexities of the Quad, it really speaks to the complexity of the new lattice work structure that's emerging in this region that's replacing the old hub and spokes. Do you think Washington has the bandwidth to try and manage this new lattice work model, though? Because just from looking at it, it just looks so much more complicated than what the old hub and spokes used to be.
And of course, we have the new Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba talking about the possibility of creating a new NATO-style collective security arrangement in Asia. So we were really wondering, what your thoughts are about how a new regional security architecture for Asia would look like.
To start with your point about Asian NATO, so I don't think there's going to be an Asian NATO anytime soon, for sure, maybe not ever. I think there's a fundamental reason, which is that the reason that NATO came about in the European context was there was a very clear threat, and it was shared at the beginning by almost all of the NATO members. And the threat was a Soviet invasion through a specific place, right? The Fulda Gap on the inner German border. And that was a threat not just to, at the time, West Germany, but also to France and to Brussels and the Netherlands and Spain and Portugal and Italy and the United Kingdom. And if you didn't stop the Soviets at the inner German border, they probably weren't going to get stopped at any of those other locations either. And so it was a unifying force. It required the NATO members to think about one contingency that involved all of them. But as you know well, in Asia, that just isn't the case. So even though there's a lot of nervousness about China in some quarters, the nervousness is about completely different contingencies in each place, right? So in Japan, it might be around the East China Sea primarily. In Taiwan, it's a cross-strait conflict. In Korea, it's probably something on the peninsula and Chinese support for Pyongyang. With Vietnam, it's probably more about the Paracels or the Sino-Vietnamese land border. With the Philippines, it's more about the Spratly Island or Scarborough Shoal. In other parts of the South China Sea, Malaysia, Indonesia could have concerns, although we haven't really seen those manifest, at least in recent years. With India, it's the Sino-Indian border. With Australia, it's more been economic security issues. So if you go down and look at each country and their worries about Chinese activities, they're very different. And I think that is a fundamental difference from the way that NATO operated in the Cold War, where there was one unifying contingency. The other major difference in my mind is that NATO had two things in common when it was created. It had shared governance systems, which opposed the governance systems of the adversary at that point, the communists versus the capitalist systems. That was a fundamental dynamic between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. But also, it wasn't just the political dynamics, it was the economic dynamics. And so there was a pretty clear dividing line between East and West. You just don't have any of this in East Asia today, or even in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And so I think the idea of an Asian NATO is not possible. And this is why these smaller and more flexible coalitions are attractive, because countries just don't have as much in common in the Indo-Pacific as some of the transatlantic allies had at the beginning of the Cold War. And so I think we're going to get very different configurations of countries. It won't look like an Asian NATO unless we have much more serious contingencies that evolve, right? If you had China invade Taiwan, could that trigger an Asian NATO? Maybe. But I don't think we're anywhere close to that type of discussion yet. And so I think what we're going to end up with is these smaller minilateral groupings, to go to your point, Kevin, that are sort of overlaid on existing bilateral hub and spokes arrangements, and also overlaid on the multilateral arrangements centered around ASEAN and ASEAN institutions. And this is just incredibly complex for American policymakers. I don't think we've got the mix right. We're probably putting a little bit more effort the last few years into the minilateral groupings just to get them up and running. And I think that makes sense. But once those are up and running, I think we'll try and come back probably to a bit more engagement at the multilateral level. And getting this right is going to be really, really hard, regardless of who the president is that the American people select in a couple of weeks.
That's true. Thank you. In that case, Zach, I wanted to ask about the coming year. Given this focus on the lattice work structure and how it's still in its relative infancy, how do you think it's going to develop after the election in November?
It's a really tough question. I think if Donald Trump wins, it's more easy to answer, because I'm pretty sure that if somebody tried to say the word lattice work to Trump, he would get pretty angry and maybe throw them out of the Oval Office. Same thing with minilateralism, all of this nonsense gobbledygook that we
Policy
in the
wonkish.
International relations, policy world would like to talk about. I do think, though, that the Trump administration did some things that were surprising, that were actually in some ways minilateral efforts, right? So engagement in the Pacific Islands is not what I would have expected from the Trump administration. It was something they prioritized that the Biden team has then taken and run with. But the driver for the Trump advisors, and maybe even for Trump himself, is probably whether this moves the needle on the China issue. And so I think that will probably be more explicit if Trump wins. The Biden team has liked to talk about the lattice work as not necessarily having anything to do with China, and often in Quad statements or other statements, they've basically not mentioned China at all. But I don't think that's the way that Trump would go. He and his team would probably be more explicit about these efforts being designed to counter Chinese influence in the region. Now, if Harris wins, I don't think her team knows exactly how they would handle this yet. They basically have only been running for president for 2 months. They haven't really built policy teams because they just don't have enough time to make it worthwhile on the campaign. So their initial approach is probably going to look a lot like what Biden has done. And I think there's a logic there. Biden has made progress on a bunch of minilateral efforts, so why not just continue that progress? But to sort of come back to where we started, the question is whether they have enough bandwidth to do all of this. If Harris can't go to the East Asia Summit, then the lattice work starts to get a little bit weakened, right? And so I think they may want to come in and have a serious discussion about which areas these groupings are delivering in and which areas they're not, and put more effort into the groups that are delivering results. And so that could be a little bit of a change from the Biden team, which has tried to do sort of everything in all these bilateral treaty arrangements, bilateral partnerships, multilateral institutions, and then also these new minilaterals. I'm just not sure that the Harris team is going to think that they can continue the momentum on all three of those areas. I think they'll probably want to make a little bit more sense of them in the long term. And that could mean a little bit, I guess, of clipping parts of the lattice work away that don't seem to be working that effectively.
Okay, so it's going to be a work in progress, essentially.
Yeah, I would expect that the Harris team would come in and do a review of existing policies under Biden. And it might take them a little while to get their new people in place and conduct that review. I don't think it's going to come out and say that they've been fundamentally wrong-headed on their engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but it might come out and say that they need to shift focus a little bit on a few different areas. And one of those areas could be how they engage in some of the minilateral groupings or engage with ASEAN, or exactly what the objective is on China. I think all of those are probably up for grabs in a Harris administration.
Yeah, and speaking of ASEAN, I think that's a good question to go to next. I mean, ASEAN, it likes to talk about how it wants to maintain its centrality, particularly with regard to regional issues. But at the same time, perhaps it's also important to ask what ASEAN can do a little bit more of to try and, facilitate engagement with Washington.
Yeah, there are kind of two ways to think about what these groupings are for. One way, which is often the way I think we imagine these meetings, is that they exist as kind of talk shops.
Yeah.
And the existence of them is important, and the fact that they meet at senior levels is important, and the bigger the better, right? The more countries that are involved, the stronger they are. I don't think that's right. I think actually what we're seeing is that in a more fragmented multipolar world, the coalitions that matter, the groups that matter, are the ones that can deliver results. So, for example, the G7 might not like everything it's doing, but it's taking a lot of actions. And part of that's because those countries have a fair amount in common. Not everything, but a fair amount. Look at BRICS. BRICS is growing rapidly, so it's meeting frequently. So I think a lot of people say, oh, wow, it's this very effective grouping. But what's it actually doing? It's not doing much of anything. And in fact, the expansion of BRICS is making it harder and harder for BRICS to accomplish anything substantial. So if you apply that logic to ASEAN, I think the takeaway, frankly, is a little bit troubling. A few years ago, we might have said, well, part of what ASEAN should be doing is bringing the US and China to the table and trying to avoid tensions across East Asia. I think now we've scaled back our ambitions a little bit for ASEAN, and it's more back to what we hoped ASEAN would do at its founding, which it was very effective at, right? Which was to moderate differences of interests and opinion within Southeast Asia and avoid conflicts here. And ASEAN has been hugely effective at that objective. But now you've got challenges within the region, and I think Myanmar is the quintessential one, which ASEAN seems to be struggling with. And so from an American perspective, I think our engagement is going to be greater with those groupings that are able to solve problems, that are able to actually deliver results. And so that suggests to me that we should focus less on whether ASEAN can mediate between the US and China. It's not going to do that effectively. It really probably needs to focus on delivering results within Southeast Asia. And I think the Myanmar issue at the moment is the most critical and urgent one.
Yes, that's certainly true, and we hope that cooperation between the US and ASEAN, particularly over this lattice work structure, can develop in the future. And with that, thanks for your time, Zach.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin and Adrian.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe and we'll see you again.